Chapter 34. It took several minutes for the Temujai commander to realize that something had gone badly wrong, for the second time. There was a gap in his line as the riders returned, he realized. Then, as he cast his glance over the battlefield, he saw the tangled bodies of men and horses and frowned. He had been watching the overall action and had missed the 4 rapid volleys that had destroyed the Ulan. He pointed with his lance at them. "What's happened there?" he demanded of his aides, but none of them had seen the destruction as it had took place. His question was greeted with blank stares. A single horseman was pounding toward them, calling his name. "General has come! General!" The man was swaying in the saddle, and the front of his leather vest was slick with blood from several wounds. Blood stained the flanks of his horse as well, and the Temujai command staff were startled to see that the horse had been hit by at least 3 arrows. Horse and rider skidded to a stop in front of the command position. For the horse it was the final effort. Weakened by loss of blood, it sank slowly to its knees, then rolled over on its side, its injured rider only managing to escape being pinned at the last moment. Hazcam frowned as he peered at the wounded man, then recognized Binzak, his former chief of intelligence. True to his word, the colonel had taken his place in the front line of one of the Ulans. It had been his incredible misfortune that he'd chosen the one destroyed by Will's archers. "General," croaked the dying man, "they have archers." He staggered a few paces toward them, and now they could see the broken-off stubs of arrows in 2 of his wounds. On the ground beside him, the horse heaved a gigantic shuddering sigh and died. "Archers," he repeated, his voice barely audible, and he sank to his knees. Hazcam tore his gaze away from the stricken colonel and scanned the enemy ranks. There was no sign of archers there. The Skandians stretched in 3 ranks across the narrowest part of the valley, behind their earthworks. On the seaward side, and a little behind the main force, stood another group, also behind earthworks and holding large rectangular shields, but he could see no sign of archers. There was one sure way to find them, he thought. He gestured toward his next 10 Ulans. "Attack," he said briefly, and the bugler sounded the call. Once more the valley filled with the jingle of harness and the thunder of hooves as they drove forward. In front of him, the colonel slumped forward, face down on the sodden grass. Hazcam made the Temujai gesture of salute, raising his left hand to his lips, then extending it out to the side in an elaborate flowing movement. His staff did likewise. Binzak had redeemed himself, he thought. In the end he had brought his general a vital piece of intelligence, even if it had cost him his own life. Will watched the approaching cavalry as once again they began their wheeling, circling dance. Horace stirred beside him, but sensed warning from the young ranger not to expose his men yet. "Wait," he said quietly. He had half expected that a concerted attack would be launched toward their position, in an attempt to wipe them out. But this attack was like the previous one, launched along the entire front. That could mean only one thing. The Temujai leaders hadn't pinpointed the archers' position. Arrows began falling on the Skandian lines, and once more the 3 ranks covered up with their shields. As before, a troop of Temujai broke off their maneuvering and drew sabers to launch a lightning attack on the unsighted Skandians. This time, however, Will was looking beyond them to identify the support group who had opened fire on the Skandians as their comrades withdrew. He saw them. An Ulan had drawn to a halt some 50 meters from the Skandian front rank. "Look!" Will yelled down the line. Then, in an aside to Horace, "Keep the shields up." He had felt the larger youth draw breath to call the next order, but Will wanted to keep his men hidden as long as possible. "Ready?" Evanlin called as the last arrow knocked onto the string. Half left again," he called, and the archers luckily understood his meaning. As one, they all turned to face the direction he had picked. He had varied their drill by calling direction first, but they seemed to understand what he wanted. "Position 3," he yelled. The arms came up to maximum elevation, the 100 of them moving as one. "Shields down," he muttered to Horace, and he heard him repeat the order. "Draw!" Beneath his breath, he told himself, count to 3 as each arm brings back its arrow to the full draw. Then aloud, "Shoot!" And instantly he screamed, "Shields up! Shields up!" As Horus took up the cry, the shields swung back into position to conceal the archers from return fire, and hopefully from observation. Again the wait. Then the volley of arrows slammed down into the Temujai Ulan, just as they were on the point of firing into the gap their comrades had forced in the shield wall. Once more, men and horses went down in screaming, tangled heaps. Grouped together as they were, and not moving, the Ulan made a perfect target for the massed arrows. At least 20 of them were down, including their commander. Now their sergeants were yelling at the survivors to get moving, to get out of this killing ground. Hazcam never saw the volley that struck his men, but he did see in his peripheral vision the concerted movement of the 100 shields as they swung back and forth like so many gates opening and closing. A few seconds later, he saw one of his foremost Ulans collapse and disintegrate. And then the shields moved again, and he saw the archers. At least 100 of them, he estimated, working smoothly and in unison as they launched another volley at the retreating Ulan that had attacked the Skandian line. The shields swung closed to cover the archers as more Temujai riders went down. Again the shields swung aside in unison, and this time he saw the solid flight of arrows, black against the sky, as they arced up and struck into another of his galloping Ulans. He turned and caught the eye of his third son, a captain on his staff. He pointed with his lance to the line of shields on the slight rise behind the Skandian ranks. "There are their archers," he said. "Take an Ulan and investigate. I want information." The captain nodded, saluted, and clapped spurs to the barrel-shaped body of his horse. He was shouting commands to the leader of the nearest troop of 60 as he galloped down the front line of the Temujai army. In their raised position behind the Skandian lines, Will and Horus were working smoothly together, pouring volley after volley into the wheeling riders. Inevitably now, they were beginning to take casualties, as individual Temujai saw them and returned fire. But the shield drill worked smoothly, and their improvised method of exposing the men to return fire for only a few seconds at a time was paying dividends. What was more, the Skandians were beginning to see the effect of the disciplined, concentrated fire on their enemies. As each volley hissed down, as arrows found their marks and Temujai saddles emptied, the waiting axemen roared their approval. For the first time, Will had seen the Kaijin sharpshooters attached to each Ulan as they attempted to take him and Horus under fire. He had just dueled with 2 of them and watched in satisfaction as the second slumped sideways out of the saddle. Horus nudged his arm and pointed. "Look," he said, and Will, following the line he indicated, saw an Ulan galloping from the Temujai lines and heading straight for them. There was no wheeling and turning for these riders. They were coming straight on at a dead run, and it was obvious where they were heading. "We've been spotted," he said, then calling to his men, "Face! Front half right! Load!" Hands reached for arrows, knocked them firmly to strings. "Ready?" That was Evanlyn once more. He grinned as he thought of how Halt had questioned the need for her to be there. Suddenly, he realized the grizzled ranger had lost the argument. He shook the thought aside, estimating the speed of the oncoming riders. Already they were shooting, and arrows were rattling on the shields along the line. But all the advantages lay with Will and his men. Shooting from a stable, unmoving, elevated position, and from behind cover, they held the upper hand in any exchange. "Position 2, he called. "Draw!" "Shields down!" Horus yelled, giving Will just the right pause. "Shoot!" shouted Will. "Shields up!" roared Horus, covering his friend as he did so. The archers were exposed to return fire for no more than a few seconds. Even so, under the constant barrage of arrows from the Temujai, they took a few casualties. Then their volley hit the onrushing Ulan and wiped out the front rank of 12, sending men and horses tumbling yet again. The riders in the following ranks tried to avoid their fallen comrades, but in vain. More horses came down, more riders tumbled out of their saddles. Some managed to leap their horses over the tangle of bodies, and they were the ones who rode clear. As the others tried to reorganize, another volley, 10 seconds behind the first, fell on them. Haskam's son, with one arrow through his right thigh and another in the soft flesh between neck and shoulder, lay across the body of his horse. He watched as the shields opened and shut, and the arrows poured out in a constant, disciplined stream. He saw the two heads moving in the fortified position at the end of the archer's line. And that was what his father needed to know. He watched as another two volleys hissed into the sky. Thankfully, these were directed at another Ulan as it galloped past. He could actually hear the commands as the two men in the command position called them. One of the voices sounded absurdly young. It was growing dark early, he reflected, and promptly realized that it could be no later than mid-morning. He craned painfully to look at the sky, but it was a brilliant blue, and with a sudden thrill of fear he realized he was dying. He was dying with urgent information that he must pass on to his father. Groaning in pain, he dragged himself to his feet and began to stumble back toward the Temujai lines, picking his way through the tangle of fallen bodies. A riderless horse cantered past him, and he tried to catch it, but was too weak. Then he heard a thunder of hoofs behind him, and a strong hand gripped the back of his sheepskin jacket and hauled him up and over the saddle bow, where he gasped and moaned with pain in his neck and leg. He angled around to see his savior. It was a sergeant from one of the other Ulans. "Take me to General Haskam. Urgent message," he managed to croak, and the sergeant, recognizing the staff insignia on his shoulders, nodded and wheeled his horse toward the command post. 3 minutes later, the mortally wounded captain told his father all that he had seen. 4 minutes later, he was dead.